Thank you for your support of the AOPLM, and it's my honor now to introduce our speaker. Sidney Blumenthal has served as our nation as senior advisor to President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and has a distinguished career as a consultant, author, and journalist, serving at publications like the Washington Post and the New Yorker. A native Illinoisan, Mr. Blumenthal has recently focused on the favorite son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, publishing now the second volume in a wonderful, really critically acclaimed biography of our 16th president. I very much enjoyed reading his excellent analysis of the man we honor here every day, and we're so pleased, very pleased and honored he could join us here in Springfield this evening. Please welcome Sidney Blumenthal.
Well, I want to thank the director of this institution, Alan Lowe. For me, this is a great honor to be here. It reminds me of what Lincoln said in his first inaugural about the mystic chords of memory. I was taken to Springfield as a boy by an older relative on a trip, and it really awakened in me a sense about the country's politics and about Abraham Lincoln. And it was an interest that I developed as a result and have carried forward. And without it, I would not have written these books. I have, since that time, always had a picture of Lincoln close by. I hung one in the White House when I served there. Not that there weren't pictures of Lincoln in the White House. When I visited Springfield as a boy, this place did not exist. There was no Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum. This is a spectacular institution. I was so happy to hear about the state of Illinois acknowledging it as an independent agency. I think that it is such a worthy endeavor. I had the privilege today of being shown some of the treasures of this museum by Ian Hunt, who is the director of research here, and Stephen Cornelius, the curator. And there's so many riches here about Lincoln and about our country that are in this vault, just yards away from us, that we can just be very glad that this institution exists. I like to read a little, and this is my poor imitation of Charles Dickens when he traveled around the country and read, and I hope you bear with me. Speaking about Lincoln in Springfield, and especially here, is a little bit like, as they used to say, bringing coals to Newcastle. You all know about Lincoln here. So some of these stories may be stories that you may know because you know Lincoln so well. In any case, it's always good to hear them again. The more time I have spent with Abraham Lincoln, the more I have come to understand that his words and actions were the careful result of his intense self-discipline. The silences that his law partner, William Henry Herndon, and his friends described as his melancholy were also a mask for his concentration, intellectual absorption, and focus. His depression and his other feelings deepened his self-awareness and spurred his self-education, which informed his understanding of human nature and politics. Even when his life seemed to have been reduced to insignificance, he was scanning the horizons and interpreting its signs. The young Lincoln, in his first formal speech at the Springfield Lyceum in 1838, could see portents of a crisis to come. He didn't know what that crisis might be. At what point, then, he asked, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, We must ourselves be its author and finisher. This book that I have written, Wrestling with His Angel, describes Lincoln's dark night of the soul, Lincoln coming to his revelation of a house divided, from which he emerges as the recognizable Lincoln of history. He would be that man until his assassination. After Lincoln's one term in the Congress and his return to his spare law office in Springfield, he stared into the distance for long periods of time. His partner, William Henry Herndon, recalled him breaking one of his prolonged silences with a cry of anguish. The political world was dead, Herndon wrote. Things were stagnant, and all hope for progress in the line of freedom seemed to be crushed out. Lincoln was speculating with me about the deadness of things and the despair which arose out of it, and deeply regretting that his human strength and power were limited by his nature to rouse and stir up the world. He said gloomily, despairingly, sadly, how hard, oh, how hard it is to die and leave one's country no better than if one had never lived for it. The world is dead to hope, deaf to its own death struggle, made known by a universal cry, what is to be done? Is anything to be done? Who can do anything? And how is it to be done? Did you ever think of these things? Almost as soon as Lincoln came back to Springfield, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, turned him right around and sent him on a mission to her hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, to serve as co-counsel to recover the Todd family fortune, which was considerable. Lincoln found himself thrust into the vortex of his native state's politics, turned into mortal combat between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The lawsuit and the politics were intertwined. So just for a moment, follow these threads. For nearly a decade, Mary's father, John S. Todd, Senator Henry Clay's business partner and political ally, had tried to wrest the Todd family fortune from Robert Wycliffe, who was known as the Old Duke. He had married Polly Todd, a Todd cousin who held the estate but had passed away. Wycliffe was wealthy and also the leader of the virulent pro-slavery movement. John Todd, running for the state senate against that movement, though he was a slaveholder himself, was demonized as an abolitionist. There were very few things that could be said about somebody that were worse than being called an abolitionist. In the middle of the campaign, in July 1849, he died of cholera. Lincoln arrived to pursue the family's case in October, just in time to observe the pro-slavery movement triumphant, rewriting the state constitution to eliminate the Kentucky law prohibiting the slave trade within its borders. Lincoln lost the case, and the Todd family lost the estate to Wycliffe. At the same moment that the political legacy of Henry Clay, Lincoln's early beau ideal of a statesman, and Mary's beloved father, was destroyed. If those events were not sufficiently embittering, there was another factor, a profound but concealed one. From memoirs, journals, and pamphlets of the time, a mystery underlying the Todd heirs v. Wycliffe case emerges. It was the Todd family secret. There was, in fact, a living heir. He was Polly Todd's grandson, the only child of her son, who had died at a relatively young age. But this heir was not legally a person under the law. He was a slave, and he had been emancipated and shipped to Liberia. In 1878, this former slave, the invisible man of the story, and Lincoln undoubtedly knew about this, and his name was Alfred Francis Russell, was elected vice president of Liberia. And in 1883, he became president. So he was Mary Todd's second relation to become a president. Back in Illinois, from Kentucky, Lincoln spoke with John Todd Stewart, his first law partner and early political mentor, a conservative old Whig. The time would soon come in which we must be Democrats or abolitionists, said Stewart, and Stewart would eventually join the Democrats. When that time comes, my mind is made up, Lincoln replied. The slavery question cannot be compromised. Stewart added that he spoke in an emphatic tone. Lincoln expressed to many of his friends his anger at the rising slave power he had observed in Kentucky. He was livid that an anti-slavery Whig lawyer he knew there, Samuel F. Miller, was driven out of the state for his views. President Lincoln would appoint him to the Supreme Court. Lincoln described young, thoughtless, and giddy-headed Kentucky slave owners with slaves trudging behind them, the most glittering, ostentatious, and displaying property in the world. Lincoln would get excited on the question, said one of his friends, and believed that the tendency of the times was to make slavery universal. Lincoln told another friend, in a few years we will be ready to accept the institution in Illinois, and the whole country will adopt it. The Todd heirs case, with its hidden history, left Lincoln smoldering in private until he emerged 5 years later. But the time for Lincoln to step forward had not come, not yet. A great revolution was required to bring Abraham Lincoln out of the wilderness. Now, Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was, as he insisted, naturally anti-slavery. Those are his words. His deepening understanding of slavery in its full complexity as a moral, political, and constitutional dilemma began in his childhood among the primitive Baptist anti-slavery dissidents in backwoods Kentucky and Indiana, whose churches his parents attended. As a boy, he rode down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where the open-air emporium of slaves on gaudy display shocked him. As a congressman, he lived in a boarding house on the site that now stands the Library of Congress, known as Abolition House. He experienced the invasion of slave catchers into the house, coming to seize one of the waiters as a fugitive slave. Undoubtedly, he knew the secret of the house where he lived, that it was a station in the Underground Railroad. He denounced the Mexican War as fraudulently started and voted numerous times against the expansion of slavery in the new Western territories, including those gained from Mexico. With the quiet assistance of the leading abolitionists in the Congress, he drafted a bill for emancipation in the District of Columbia, which never received a single hearing in the House of Representatives. And then he came home to an obscurity that seemed as though it would never end. Suddenly, in 1854, the once and future rivals of Lincoln combined to blow to smithereens the cornerstone of civil and political peace. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, seeking a transforming gesture that would carry him to the Democratic nomination and the presidency, and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, heir to slaveholding fortune and the de facto acting president of the United States, operating behind the weakling Franklin Pierce, converged in their collaboration on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That act repealed the Missouri Compromise that had forbidden slavery north of a line of middle latitude and now made possible the extension of slavery to the West. In a stroke, the old political order cracked apart. We were, said Lincoln, thunderstruck and stunned, and we reeled and fell in utter confusion. He was describing the atmosphere of the early resistance. But we rose, each fighting, said Lincoln, grasping whatever he could first reach, a scythe, a pitchfork, a chopping axe, or a butcher's cleaver. We struck in the direction of the sound. In two brief autobiographies, Lincoln depicted himself in his wilderness period as strangely content in a kind of internal exile here in Springfield, becoming nearly indifferent to politics, immersed in his legal practice. As he was contemplating his race for the presidency, he told the Chicago Tribune in 1854 his profession had almost superseded the thought of politics in his mind when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused him as he had never been before. Well, it was about this decisive juncture in Lincoln's career that Herndon wrote of his partner's ambition. That man, wrote Herndon, who thinks Lincoln calmly sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. He was always calculating and always planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. Lincoln clung to the hull of the sinking Whig Party longer than some, but he also knew that a new coalition against the extension of slavery must be organized. In this period of party chaos, Lincoln cast himself into the whirlwind, sequestering himself in the law library of the old state capitol, and I was in that room today. He drafted his speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, stepping onto the podium to speak at the Illinois Hall of Representatives, and you've all been there. On October 4th, 1854, he never again left the stage of history. Lincoln, the defender of the Declaration of Independence and its precept that all men are created equal, invoked in that speech the blood of the Revolution, the American Revolution. Lincoln, the Shakespearean, whose favorite play was Macbeth, pointed to the moral wrong of slavery. Like the bloody hand, you may wash it and wash it. The red witness of guilt still sticks and stares horribly at you. In this chaotic period, many movements swirled across the landscape, for and against slavery, against immigrants, and against liquor. But the nativist and temperance movements confounded the development of the anti-slavery one. Meanwhile, anti-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs, with long grudges, still regarded each other with mutual suspicion. Some people in the abolitionist movement in Illinois understood that a more proficient and effective political figure was required to draw the elements together. And that brought them, at the end of Lincoln's speech at the Hall of Representatives, to come up to him and ask them to join a meeting of a group they called the Republican Party. but it just consisted of them. And Lincoln dodged them. He said he had a law case in a distant town. The decline and fall of the Whigs did not inevitably mean that there would be a new party of, by, and for Lincoln. There was no imperative except that which was within Lincoln himself. In retrospect, his closest contemporaries thought him prescient. Lincoln's whole life was a calculation of the forces and ultimate results. The world to him was a question of cause and effect, reflected his friend, the Illinois lawyer and fellow Whig, Leonard Swett. He believed the results to which certain causes tended would surely follow. He did not believe that those results would be materially hastened or impeded. His whole political history, especially since the agitation of the slavery question, has been based upon this theory. He believed from the first, I think, that the agitation of slavery would produce its overthrow, and he acted upon the result as though it was present from the beginning. His tactics were to get himself in the right place and remain there still until events would find him in that place. Now, another friend of Lincoln, John W. Bunn, a Springfield merchant and Whig partisan who funded Lincoln's campaigns, and yes, there was fundraising, judged Lincoln unique among politicians. Lincoln's entire career proves that it is quite possible for a man to be adroit and skillful and effective in politics without in any degree sacrificing moral principles. Little men try to do the same things he did and make very bad work of it. For years, Lincoln had turned over in his mind the menace of slavery to democracy until, in 1855, he envisioned the prospect of what was to come. I think that there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. He wrote his co-counsel in the Todd Ayers case, George Robertson, a Kentucky judge. The signal failure of Henry Clay and other good and great men in 1849 to effect anything in favor of gradual emancipation in Kentucky, together with 1,000 other signs, extinguishes that hope utterly. Yet another complicating factor entered into the equation. Between 1845 and 1854, 3 million immigrants arrived in the country. It was the first great wave of immigration into America. About 40% were poor Irish Catholics fleeing the ravages of the potato famine. About another 40% were Germans escaping from the failed liberal revolution of 1848. Conservative Protestants viewed the Irish especially as a source of crime, corruption, and poverty. Both the Irish and Germans were beer drinkers, a habit that aroused temperance crusaders who condemned them as drunken, lazy, and sinful. A new party arose. This party had a name. It was called the KnowNothings, the Know Nothing Party. It took its name from the idea that when they were asked if they were members of it, they should respond, "I know nothing." It sprang from a small nativist sect in New York City called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Within months after the 1852 election, it attracted an estimated membership of more than 1 million. Its program held that only Protestant-born citizens should hold public office under the slogan, "Americans only shall govern America." As the crisis deepened, Lincoln wondered how he could be effective fighting slavery while maintaining his identity in the crumbling Whig Party. On August 24th, 1855, he wrote his intimate friend Joshua Speed, with whom he had shared a room in Springfield. and who was now presiding over his family's Kentucky plantation. They had both been Whigs, but there was no real Whig party anymore. Lincoln disagreed with Speed about slavery. And in the forefront of his thinking was the threat of the Know-Nothings. "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain," he wrote Speed. "How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know-Nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." Now, state by state across the country, this new Republican Party was being organized. In Illinois, a group of anti-slavery newspaper editors invited Lincoln to join them as their leader at a meeting to organize a convention of the new state party in Illinois. Lincoln was absent at the time, recalled Herndon, and believing I knew what his feelings and judgment on the vital questions of the hour were, I took the liberty to sign his name to the call. John Todd Stewart tried to remove Lincoln's endorsement. He rushed into the office and excitedly asked if Lincoln had signed the abolition call. I answered in the negative, adding that I had signed his name myself. To the question, "Did Lincoln authorize you to sign it?" I returned an emphatic no. Then exclaimed the startled and indignant Stewart, "You have ruined him." I thought I understood Lincoln thoroughly, Herndon wrote, but in order to vindicate myself, if assailed, I immediately sat down after Stewart rushed out of the office and wrote Lincoln, who was then in Tazewell County attending court, a brief account of what I had done and how much stir it was creating in the ranks of his conservative friends. If he approved or disapproved my course, I asked him to write or telegraph me at once. In a brief time came his reply, "All right, go ahead, radicals and all." At that meeting, on February 22nd, 1856, George Washington's birthday, George Schneider, editor of the German-language newspaper Staatszeitung in Chicago, proposed a plank denouncing the Know-Nothings. But the nativists who were present strongly opposed it. The conference to organize the Republican Party threatened to collapse. Schneider announced, finally, he would submit his resolution to Lincoln and abide by his decision. "Gentlemen," declared Lincoln, "the resolution introduced by Mr. Schneider is nothing new. It is already contained in the Declaration of Independence, and you can't form a new party on other principles." This declaration of Mr. Lincoln's, Schneider recalled, saved the resolution and, in fact, helped to establish the new party on the most liberal democratic basis. Lincoln's judgment made possible the creation of the Illinois Republican Party, which became the instrument that would, in 4 years, carry him to the Republican nomination for president. But he could not foresee that distant future, nor could he predict the shocking 10 days that shook the world that would soon polarize and clarify the conflict. On May 19th, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech on the attack on democracy that he called the crime against Kansas. On May 21st, an army of nearly 1,000 pro-slavery Missourians under a red banner inscribed Southern Rights rampaged into the free state town of Lawrence to ransack it. The next day in the Senate, Sumner sat writing at his desk, and Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina came up to him and battered him relentlessly on the head with a gold-handled cane, nearly killing him in retribution. Blood streamed across the floor of the United States Senate. 2 days later, on May 24th, along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, a radical abolitionist settler there named John Brown and his followers hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death. 5 days later, on May 29th, in Bloomington, Illinois, at the Republican convention, its founding convention, Lincoln stood as a Republican for the first time and spoke in a speech that so astonished people that all of the reporters who were present, all of the lawyers who were used to taking notes in courtrooms, simply put down their pens and listened. And there is no account of that one speech of Lincoln's because of that. It is known as Lincoln's lost speech. Ultimately, Ralph Waldo Emerson would declare, his mind mastered the problem of the day, and as the problem grew, so did his comprehension of it. Rarely was a man so fitted to the event. Within 2 years of assuming his new identity as a Republican, Lincoln sounded his own note of destiny. Lincoln's language was drenched not only in Shakespeare, but also drawn from 2 passages in the King James Bible. From the Gospel of Mark, if a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. From the Gospel of Luke, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. On June 16, 1858, declaring his candidacy for the United States Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln explained, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it." Now remember, just a few years earlier, he is alone in his law office with Herndon and wondering what is to be done. But now he knows, and he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. By now, Lincoln's sense of historical time and political timing had become acute. 2 weeks after his defeat to Douglas, he wrote to a friend, "The fight must go on. The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats." In 1860, beginning his campaign for the Republican presidential nomination, in his speech at Cooper Union in New York City, Lincoln concluded, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." Lincoln's political education was long, but many of the moments of Lincoln's awakening from his period of political slumber were not publicly known until years after his death. In early 1855, a free black woman, whom the historical record inscribes only as Polly, appeared at the office of Lincoln and Herndon with a tale of woe. Her son, had hired himself on a steamboat on the Mississippi, something like what Lincoln had done years earlier. But when he reached New Orleans without free papers, proving that he was not a slave, he was imprisoned and to be sold into slavery. Lincoln appealed to the governor, Joel Matson, a Democrat and close ally of Douglas, who informed Lincoln he could do nothing. Lincoln also appealed to the governor of Louisiana, who similarly rejected his request. Again, Lincoln returned to Matson's office, and again he was denied. So, Lincoln and Herndon raised sufficient funds and located an agent in New Orleans to purchase the young man's liberty. Soon, his prison door swung open, and he was returned to his mother in Springfield. Lincoln had bought a slave to free him. It was Lincoln's first act of emancipation. At about the same time, in early 1855, traveling the county court circuit, staying overnight in a boarding house, his discussion with a former judge and fellow lawyer, T. Lyle Dickey, a conservative old Whig, went on deep into the night. Judge Dickey contended that slavery was an institution which the Constitution recognized and which could not be disturbed. Lincoln argued that ultimately slavery must become extinct, recalled another Illinois lawyer who was present. After a while, said Dickey, we went upstairs to bed. There were 2 beds in our room, and I remember that Lincoln sat up in his nightshirt on the edge of the bed, arguing the point with me. At last, we went to sleep. Early in the morning, I woke up, and there was Lincoln half sitting up in the bed. Dickey, said Lincoln, I tell you, this nation cannot exist half slave and half free. Oh, Lincoln, replied Dickey, go to sleep. Thank you.